Rain poured relentlessly over downtown Chicago as evening commuters hurried through crowded sidewalks without looking at the people sleeping beneath the bridges. Expensive cars splashed through puddles while businessmen rushed toward glowing office towers, carefully avoiding eye contact with the homeless men sitting quietly along the street. Ethan Brooks had seen the same scene thousands of times through the tinted windows of his black Mercedes. Normally, he would continue driving toward his penthouse after another exhausting day, running one of the country's fastest growing technology companies. But tonight something unusual caught his attention. A delivery truck suddenly lost control on the rain-soaked intersection, sliding directly toward an elderly homeless man who appeared too weak to move. Without thinking, Ethan shouted for his driver to stop. Before security could react, he threw open the car door and sprinted through the rain. People nearby froze in shock as one of Chicago's most recognizable millionaires tackled the old man out of the truck's path, only seconds before the vehicle crashed into a traffic light. The impact echoed across the entire block. Broken glass scattered everywhere while frightened pedestrians screamed and ran for safety. Ethan slowly stood, helping the old man to his feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The homeless man shook his head quietly. "No, thanks to you." Ethan noticed something strange. Despite wearing torn clothes and soaked shoes, the man spoke with remarkable calm and education. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet gratitude. Ethan offered him his expensive coat. The old man politely refused. "Someone else probably needs it more." That answer surprised Ethan even more than the rescue itself. Most people living on the streets accepted any help immediately, yet this man seemed determined to keep his dignity. Ethan insisted, finally placing the coat over the man's shoulders anyway. As he adjusted the sleeve, something caught his eye. Beneath the wet fabric rested an old silver wristwatch. Time seemed to stop. Ethan's breathing became uneven. He stared at the watch in complete disbelief. The scratched silver case, the cracked leather strap, and the tiny engraved initials on the back were identical to the watch he had given his younger brother Daniel on his 18th birthday, 22 years earlier. Only weeks before, Daniel disappeared without a trace. Police never found a body. They never found the watch. They never found a single clue explaining what had happened. Yet now, impossibly, that very watch rested on the wrist of a homeless stranger standing only inches away. Ethan slowly reached toward it before stopping himself. His voice barely escaped his lips. "Where did you get this watch?" The old man's expression changed instantly. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something that looked frighteningly close to fear. Without answering, he stepped backward into the rain. Ethan took another step forward. "Please, tell me where you got it." The old man looked directly into Ethan's eyes for several long seconds before whispering only one sentence. "Some memories should stay buried." Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd before Ethan or his security team could stop him. Ethan remained frozen in the middle of the street, staring after the stranger as rain soaked his suit. For the first time in more than 20 years, he felt certain his brother's disappearance had never been the accident everyone believed it was. Somewhere inside the city, a homeless man was carrying the last thing Daniel Brooks had ever owned, and Ethan knew he would never sleep again until he discovered why. Ethan Brooks stood motionless in the pouring rain long after the homeless man disappeared into the crowded streets. His security team surrounded him, urging him to return to the waiting car, but he barely heard a single word they said. His eyes remained fixed on the direction the old man had vanished, replaying every tiny detail of the silver wristwatch over and over in his mind. It couldn't have been a coincidence. 22 years earlier, Ethan had personally commissioned that watch from a small family-owned jeweler in Boston. The initials engraved on the back DB for Daniel Brooks had been carved by hand, along with a tiny scratch near the 12 o'clock marker that happened during the engraving process. No other watch in the world should have looked exactly like it. Yet the homeless stranger had been wearing it as naturally as though it had belonged to him for years. Mr. Brooks, his head of security asked cautiously. Should we call the police? Ethan slowly shook his head. No. Then what do you want us to do? Ethan looked toward the crowded intersection, where hundreds of people continued walking as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Find him. The security chief frowned. Sir, this is downtown Chicago. He could be anywhere by now. Ethan's voice became firmer. Then search everywhere. Within minutes, nearly a dozen members of Ethan's private security team spread throughout the surrounding streets, checking shelters, train stations, underpasses, soup kitchens, and nearby parks. Ethan remained inside his car, staring at an old photograph stored in his phone. It showed him standing beside his younger brother Daniel on Daniel's 18th birthday. Both of them were smiling, and on Daniel's left wrist rested the exact same silver watch. Ethan had not looked at that picture in nearly 5 years. Every anniversary of Daniel's disappearance reopened wounds that had never truly healed. The police investigation had eventually concluded that Daniel likely drowned after his car was found abandoned near Lake Michigan, but no body was ever recovered. Ethan never accepted that conclusion. Somewhere deep inside, he had always believed his brother was still connected to the world in some unfinished way. Tonight, that impossible feeling suddenly seemed real again. Several hours passed without success. One by one, the security teams reported back. No one had seen the homeless man again. Surveillance cameras around the intersection captured him walking through the crowd before disappearing beneath an elevated train platform, where every camera angle suddenly lost sight of him. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Ethan finally returned home after midnight, but sleep never came. Instead, he unlocked a wooden box hidden inside his study, one he hadn't opened in over 20 years. Inside were every newspaper clipping, police report, photograph, and handwritten note connected to Daniel's disappearance. The last page contained the inventory of Daniel's personal belongings recovered by investigators. Wallet, keys, jacket, empty backpack. One line remained permanently circled in red ink. Watch, not recovered. Ethan slowly closed the file. For 2 decades, that missing watch had represented unanswered questions. Now it represented hope. The following morning, Ethan canceled every meeting on his calendar. His assistant protested that investors from New York had already arrived for a billion-dollar merger discussion, but Ethan ignored them all. Instead, he drove personally to every homeless shelter within 20 miles of downtown. Most people recognized him immediately, assuming he was visiting on behalf of his charitable foundation. He quietly showed shelter directors a printed photograph generated from security footage of the old man. Most shook their heads. Then, at a small church-run soup kitchen on the city's west side, an elderly volunteer paused when she saw the picture. "I know him," she said. Ethan immediately leaned forward. "Where?" The woman smiled gently. "Around here everyone calls him Michael." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "Michael what?" She shrugged. "He never tells anyone his last name." Ethan asked dozens of questions. The volunteer explained that Michael had been living on the streets for almost 15 years. He never begged. He never stole. Every morning he helped clean the kitchen before eating a single bowl of soup and quietly leaving. Some volunteers believed he had once been a teacher, because he often spent afternoons reading old books in the public library. Others believed he had been a soldier because of the way he always sat facing exits. Nobody actually knew the truth. "Does he still come here?" Ethan asked. The woman nodded. "Almost every Thursday." Ethan looked at the calendar on the wall. Today was Thursday. Less than 20 minutes later, the front door slowly opened. The room fell strangely quiet as the same homeless man from the previous evening stepped inside carrying a worn canvas backpack. His clothes were cleaner than before but still badly worn, and the familiar silver watch remained visible beneath the sleeve of his faded jacket. The moment Michael looked up and saw Ethan waiting inside, he stopped walking. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The volunteers sensed something unusual and quietly returned to their work. Pretending not to watch, Ethan slowly approached. "I've been looking for you." Michael gave a tired smile. "I figured you would." Ethan looked down at the watch again before raising his eyes. "Please, tell me where you got it." Michael studied Ethan's face for a long moment before quietly answering. "If I tell you the truth, you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you had never asked." Ethan stood completely still, unable to take his eyes off the silver watch resting on Michael's wrist. The soup kitchen around them faded into the background as though every sound had suddenly disappeared. The old man's words echoed inside his mind. "If I tell you the truth, you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you had never asked." Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "I've spent 22 years searching for my brother. I don't think there's anything left that can hurt me more than not knowing." Michael lowered his eyes toward the watch and gently ran his thumb across its scratched metal case. His movements were slow, almost affectionate, as though he had carried it through countless storms. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth doesn't heal old wounds. Sometimes it opens new ones." Ethan took another step closer. "Then let me decide whether it's worth it." Michael looked into Ethan's eyes for several long seconds before sighing deeply. "Not here." Ethan glanced around the crowded soup kitchen. Volunteers continued serving meals, pretending not to notice the tension between the two men. Michael picked up a paper cup of coffee and walked toward a small table near the back window. After a brief hesitation, Ethan followed him. They sat across from each other in silence until Michael finally spoke again. "Tell me something first." Ethan nodded. "Anything." Michael folded his weathered hands together. "Do you still believe your brother died the night he disappeared?" Ethan answered immediately. "No." Michael studied his face carefully. "Why?" Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed the old photograph he had looked at the night before. He placed it gently on the table. "Because Daniel never took that watch off. If you're wearing it today, then someone alive took it from him." Michael stared at the photograph for several seconds before slowly pushing it back. "You're wrong." Ethan frowned. "About what?" Michael looked directly into his eyes. "Nobody took it from him." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Then how did you get it?" Michael hesitated. "He gave it to me." For a moment Ethan couldn't breathe. Every logical explanation he had built over the last 22 years collapsed in an instant. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible." Michael remained calm. "I understand why you think that." Ethan's voice rose despite himself. "My brother disappeared 22 years ago." Michael nodded. "I know." Ethan leaned across the table. "Then tell me where you saw him." Michael looked out the rain-covered window instead of answering. "I promised him I wouldn't." Ethan slammed his hand against the table hard enough to make the coffee spill over the edge. Several volunteers looked toward them in surprise before quickly returning to work. "Enough promises," Ethan said through clenched teeth. "I've buried my parents. I've watched my mother die believing her youngest son drowned alone. I've spent half my life searching for answers. If you know something, you don't get to keep it from me." Michael remained completely silent until Ethan finally sat back down, breathing heavily. Only then did the old man speak. "Your brother saved my life." Ethan froze. Michael continued quietly. 22 years ago I wasn't homeless. I was an engineer working for a private shipping company on the south side of Chicago. One night I witnessed something I was never supposed to see." Ethan listened without interrupting. Several powerful men were moving containers through the harbor under false shipping manifests. Human trafficking, weapons, money laundering. I reported what I found. Michael lowered his eyes. "That was the biggest mistake of my life." Ethan felt a chill run through his body. Michael continued. "Within 48 hours my house burned down. My wife disappeared. My son vanished on his way home from school. The police called it a coincidence." Ethan slowly whispered, "And my brother?" Michael's eyes filled with pain. "Daniel was the only person who believed me." Ethan stared at the old man in disbelief. Daniel had never mentioned any of this. Michael reached into his worn backpack and carefully removed a small leather notebook tied together with faded string. The cover had nearly fallen apart from age. He asked me to keep this safe if anything happened to him. Ethan's hands began trembling as Michael placed the notebook on the table between them. Across the front cover, written in unmistakable handwriting, were two words Ethan recognized immediately: Daniel Brooks. Ethan slowly reached toward it but stopped before touching the cover. His throat tightened. "I've seen this handwriting before." Michael nodded. "Because your brother wrote in this journal every day." Ethan looked up. "Have you read it?" Michael answered quietly. "Only the first page." Ethan frowned. "Why not the rest?" Michael looked toward the watch on his wrist. "Because Daniel told me the rest belonged to one person." Ethan barely managed to whisper, "Me." Michael nodded. "He said if he never came home, his brother would know what to do." Before Ethan could open the journal, the front doors of the soup kitchen suddenly burst open. 3 men wearing dark suits stepped inside and slowly scanned every face in the room. One of them quietly lifted his sleeve, revealing a silver wristwatch identical to Daniel's, except the initials engraved on the back read RL. Michael's face turned white. Without taking his eyes off the men, he whispered only 4 words. "They found us first." Ethan instinctively slid Daniel's journal beneath his jacket, just as the 3 men began walking deeper into the soup kitchen. Their expensive suits stood out sharply against the worn wooden tables and chipped coffee cups surrounding them. None of them looked like ordinary businessmen. They moved too carefully, too confidently, scanning every corner of the room without appearing hurried. Michael quietly lowered his head. "Don't look at them," he whispered. "If they think you recognize them, they'll never stop following you." Ethan kept his eyes fixed on his untouched coffee, but his peripheral vision never left the men. One of them spoke briefly with a volunteer before casually glancing around the room again. Then his eyes settled directly on Michael. A faint smile crossed his face. Ethan immediately understood. They hadn't come looking for him. They had come looking for Michael. "Back door," Michael whispered without moving his lips. "When I stand up, don't hesitate." Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. The old man slowly rose from his chair, picked up his backpack, and began walking toward the kitchen as though he intended to refill his coffee. One of the suited men immediately started following him. Ethan counted silently in his head. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly Michael knocked over an entire rack of metal trays. The deafening crash echoed through the building. Volunteers screamed as dozens of trays scattered across the floor. In the confusion, Ethan grabbed the journal, rushed through the kitchen, and followed Michael toward a narrow service hallway leading to the rear exit. They burst through the back door into a rain-soaked alley, just as angry voices erupted behind them. "They're running!" someone shouted. Ethan and Michael sprinted through the maze of narrow streets, splashing through puddles while sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. Michael, despite being more than 60 years old, seemed to know every shortcut in the neighborhood. He turned sharply into an abandoned warehouse district before finally stopping beneath an old railway bridge. Both men struggled to catch their breath. Ethan looked back. No one had followed them, at least not yet. Michael leaned against a concrete pillar, coughing heavily. Ethan stepped forward. "Who are those men?" Michael slowly removed the silver watch from his wrist for the first time since they had met. He carefully placed it in Ethan's hand. "Look inside." Ethan turned the watch over. Hidden beneath the worn leather strap was a tiny compartment he had never noticed before. His fingers carefully opened it. Folded inside was a piece of paper no larger than a postage stamp. He unfolded it carefully. Written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting were only 5 words. "Never trust Richard Lawson alive." Ethan's breathing stopped. "Richard Lawson?" Michael nodded slowly. "The man wearing the watch with the initials RL." Ethan stared at the tiny note. "Who is he?" Michael closed his eyes. "The man your brother died trying to expose." Ethan immediately looked up. "You just said Daniel gave you the watch." Michael's eyes filled with guilt. I said he gave it to me. He paused for several painful seconds. I never said he survived. Ethan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Every hope he had carried since seeing the watch the previous evening collapsed in an instant. No, he whispered. You're lying. Michael slowly shook his head. I wish I were. Ethan's voice cracked. What happened to him? Michael looked toward the rain falling beyond the bridge. He saved my life. Ethan grabbed the old man's shoulders. Tell me everything. Michael nodded weakly. 22 years ago, Richard Lawson discovered that Daniel had copied documents proving millions of dollars had been stolen through fake shipping companies connected to organized crime. Daniel planned to deliver everything to federal investigators. Michael swallowed painfully before continuing. Richard found out first. Ethan could barely breathe. Michael's voice became quieter. Daniel hid me inside an old maintenance tunnel beneath Navy Pier. He handed me this watch and the journal. Tears rolled down the old man's face. His last words were, "If my brother ever finds you, give him both." Ethan stood frozen in complete silence. Michael looked at him with overwhelming sadness. Then he walked back outside. Ethan whispered, "And?" Michael closed his eyes. I heard gunshots. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Only the sound of rain filled the empty space beneath the bridge. Finally, Ethan looked down at Daniel's journal still tucked beneath his jacket. With trembling hands, he opened it for the first time. The first page contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, Ethan, it means I couldn't make it home. Before Ethan could continue reading, Michael suddenly grabbed his arm with surprising force. His eyes widened toward the far end of the bridge. Ethan slowly turned around. Parked beneath the shadows were 3 black SUVs with their headlights switched off. One by one, their doors opened. The same 3 suited men stepped out, but this time they weren't alone. A 4th man emerged from the middle vehicle wearing a perfectly tailored gray coat. His hair had turned silver with age, but his posture remained confident. He slowly adjusted the silver watch on his wrist before smiling calmly in Ethan's direction. Michael's voice trembled. Richard Lawson. Ethan stared at the silver-haired man stepping calmly out of the black SUV, and for a brief moment, the world around him seemed to disappear. Richard Lawson looked nothing like the ruthless criminal Ethan had imagined over the past few minutes. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a successful businessman. His tailored gray overcoat fit perfectly, his polished shoes reflected the rain-soaked pavement beneath the bridge, and the silver watch on his wrist gleamed beneath the streetlights. Only his eyes betrayed him. They were cold, emotionless, and frighteningly patient, like someone who had spent decades waiting for exactly this moment. Richard smiled politely before speaking in a calm voice that barely rose above the sound of the rain. "Mr. Brooks," he said. "I've been hoping we'd finally meet." Ethan instinctively stepped in front of Michael, shielding the older man from view. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Michael slowly shook his head. "It won't matter." Richard casually placed both hands inside his coat pockets. "There's no need for anyone to get hurt tonight," he continued. "I simply came to retrieve something that belongs to me." Ethan immediately understood. Daniel's journal. Richard smiled slightly. "Smart man." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It never belonged to you." Richard sighed almost sympathetically. "Your brother would disagree." Ethan felt anger surge through every part of his body. "Don't you dare speak for my brother." Richard remained perfectly composed. Daniel made a very unfortunate decision 22 years ago. He chose loyalty over survival. Ethan took another step forward. "You murdered him." Richard's smile disappeared. For the first time, his expression became completely unreadable. "That's a very serious accusation." Ethan held Daniel's journal tightly beneath his arm. "Tell me I'm wrong." Richard looked directly into Ethan's eyes for several long seconds before quietly answering, "Some men die because they're brave. Others die because they mistake bravery for wisdom." The three armed men beside Richard slowly spread out beneath the bridge, cutting off every obvious escape route. Ethan quickly looked around, calculating distances. The nearest street lay almost 200 feet away across open pavement. There was no chance of outrunning four healthy men while protecting Michael. Richard noticed Ethan studying the surroundings and smiled again. "You're thinking like your brother." Ethan said nothing. Richard continued walking forward one slow step at a time until only a few yards separated them. Daniel believed exposing the truth would save innocent people. I admired his optimism. Ethan could barely control his voice. "You destroyed his life." Richard tilted his head slightly. "No, Mr. Brooks. Your brother destroyed his own life the moment he refused my offer." Ethan frowned. "Offer?" Richard nodded. "I offered him wealth beyond imagination. A partnership. A future. All he had to do was forget what he had seen." Michael suddenly spoke from behind Ethan. "He told you no." Richard slowly looked toward the old homeless man. "Yes." His voice remained strangely calm. "He chose you instead." Michael lowered his eyes. "He chose what was right." Richard laughed quietly. "And where did righteousness leave either of you?" He gestured toward Michael's worn clothing. One became homeless. Then he looked back at Ethan. The other spent 22 years mourning a brother who could have lived like a king. Ethan's hands tightened around the journal. "If Daniel refused you, why didn't you destroy the journal yourself?" Richard answered almost immediately. "Because I never found it." Michael slowly stepped beside Ethan despite the danger. He searched for decades. Richard gave a small nod. "I searched because your friend here disappeared before I could finish our conversation." Michael looked directly at him. "You killed my family." Richard remained silent. Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "My wife, my son. They had nothing to do with any of this." Richard looked almost bored. Collateral damage is unfortunate, but sometimes necessary. Ethan felt rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. Without thinking, he lunged toward Richard. Before he reached him, one of Richard's bodyguards struck Ethan hard across the ribs, knocking him violently onto the wet concrete. Daniel's journal slid several feet away. Another guard immediately rushed toward it. Michael reacted faster than anyone expected. Despite his age, he threw himself across the ground, grabbing the journal only seconds before the guard reached it. "Run!" Michael shouted. Ethan forced himself back to his feet just as Michael tossed the journal toward him. Ethan caught it instinctively. At that exact moment, headlights suddenly flooded the bridge from the opposite direction. Several police vehicles screeched to a stop, blocking the exit. Officers poured out with weapons drawn. "Police! Nobody move!" Richard looked toward the flashing lights without the slightest hint of panic. He smiled faintly at Ethan. "We'll finish this another day." Before anyone could stop him, one of his bodyguards threw a small metal canister onto the ground. Thick white smoke exploded beneath the bridge, instantly reducing visibility to almost nothing. Officers shouted commands through the smoke while footsteps echoed in every direction. Ethan coughed violently, desperately searching for Michael. "Michael!" he shouted. There was no answer. The smoke slowly cleared after nearly a minute. Richard and all three bodyguards had vanished. Ethan looked around frantically until he spotted Michael, lying motionless against one of the concrete pillars. He ran toward him. The old man's shirt was stained with blood spreading rapidly across his chest. Ethan dropped to his knees. "Michael!" Michael slowly opened his eyes. His breathing had become shallow. With trembling fingers, he reached into Ethan's coat pocket and gently pushed the journal deeper inside. "Don't let them take it," he whispered. Ethan pressed both hands against the wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me. The ambulance is coming." Michael managed a faint smile. "Your brother," he whispered painfully. "He never stopped believing you'd finish what he started." Ethan leaned closer. "Michael, where's the evidence?" The old man looked into Ethan's eyes one final time. His lips moved so quietly Ethan almost couldn't hear the words. Read, the last page. Ethan's hands shook uncontrollably as he pressed against Michael's wound, desperately trying to slow the bleeding while police officers secured the bridge. The old man's breathing became weaker with every passing second, yet his eyes never left Ethan's face. Read the last page, he whispered again before his body suddenly relaxed. Michael, Ethan shouted, refusing to let go. Paramedics rushed toward them, pushing Ethan gently aside as they began emergency treatment. One medic checked Michael's pulse while another attached oxygen and started chest compressions. Ethan stood frozen only a few feet away, Daniel's journal clutched tightly against his chest. After several agonizing minutes, one paramedic slowly looked up at his partner and quietly shook his head. The compressions stopped. The oxygen mask was removed. A white sheet was carefully pulled over Michael's body. Ethan stared in complete silence. Less than 24 hours earlier, he hadn't even known the old homeless man existed. Now he had become the last living connection to Daniel. And he was gone. Detective James Sullivan approached slowly, removing his hat out of respect. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Ethan barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the sheet covering Michael's face. "He survived 22 years on the streets," Ethan whispered. "Only to die protecting my brother's journal." Sullivan nodded solemnly. "Whoever Richard Lawson really is, he's willing to kill to keep the past buried." Ethan finally looked at the detective. "You're going to tell me this man died 38 years ago again?" Sullivan hesitated before answering. "No." He looked toward the empty road where Richard's SUVs had disappeared. "After tonight, I believe someone has been protecting his identity for decades." Ethan's expression hardened. "Then we stopped chasing a ghost." Sullivan frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan held up Daniel's journal. "We let this tell us who Richard really is." Back at Ethan's penthouse, the city's skyline stretched silently beyond the glass walls, while heavy rain continued falling outside. Olivia Brooks had arrived within minutes after hearing about the attack beneath the bridge. She paced nervously across the living room while Ethan sat alone at the dining table, staring at Daniel's worn leather journal. "This is insane," Olivia said. "You're talking about a conspiracy that supposedly lasted 22 years. Ethan looked up calmly. "Michael died because of this journal." Olivia stopped pacing. "And that's exactly why you should hand it over to the FBI." Ethan slowly shook his head. "Richard knew the police were coming tonight." Olivia frowned. "What are you saying?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. Someone warned him. The room fell silent. Detective Sullivan, who had remained with them, quietly placed several crime scene photographs onto the table. Richard escaped exactly 43 seconds before the first police car reached the bridge. Olivia looked confused. Sullivan continued, "Only someone monitoring police communications could have known we were coming." Ethan slowly nodded. "Or someone inside law enforcement." Sullivan didn't deny it. Instead, he simply looked toward the journal. "Open it." Ethan took a deep breath before carefully turning the pages. Most entries described ordinary moments between two brothers. Daniel wrote about college, family dinners, dreams of starting his own engineering company, and how proud he was of Ethan's growing success. The journal felt heartbreakingly normal. Then everything changed. About halfway through, the handwriting became hurried and uneven. Daniel described discovering fraudulent shipping records hidden inside abandoned warehouses along the Chicago docks. He mentioned Richard Lawson by name for the first time. He wrote about people disappearing after asking too many questions. Several pages later, Ethan found something even more disturbing. Folded carefully between two entries was a newspaper clipping showing a smiling city councilman standing beside Richard Lawson at a charity fundraiser held 23 years earlier. Ethan immediately recognized the politician. Senator William Carter, one of the most powerful men in Illinois. Olivia leaned over his shoulder. "Wait," she whispered. "He became governor later." Sullivan slowly nodded. "And after that, Secretary of Commerce." Ethan continued reading. Daniel had circled William Carter's face in red ink with only one handwritten sentence beneath the photograph. He isn't protecting Richard. Richard is protecting him. The room became completely silent. Olivia slowly stepped backward. That's impossible. Sullivan looked pale. If Daniel was right, this wasn't just organized crime. It reached the highest levels of government. Ethan turned page after page until only one remained. The final page. The page Michael had died to protect. Unlike the rest of the journal, it contained no diary entry. No explanation. Only a simple hand-drawn map. At the center of the map was a single location circled in black ink. St. Matthew's Cemetery. Beneath it, Daniel had written one final message. If you're reading this, Ethan, don't look for me. Look beneath Mother's. No one spoke for several long seconds. Ethan continued staring at the final page as though the words might somehow change if he looked long enough. Don't look for me. Look beneath Mother's grave. His pulse quickened. Their mother, Margaret Brooks, had been buried 20 years earlier in St. Matthew's Cemetery after a long battle with cancer. Ethan personally visited her grave every Mother's Day and every Christmas. He had stood only inches above that exact spot dozens of times, never imagining Daniel had hidden something beneath it. Olivia slowly lowered herself into the chair across from him. Daniel couldn't have meant that literally, she whispered. He would never ask you to disturb Mom's grave. Ethan closed the journal carefully. Daniel never wasted words. Detective Sullivan nodded. If he wrote it, he had a reason. Olivia looked between the two men. You're seriously talking about digging up our mother's grave? Ethan remained silent. Sullivan answered instead. Not tonight. First, we find out why Daniel chose that location. Ethan stood and walked the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. Rain still covered the glass, blurring the city lights into endless streaks of silver. 22 years of unanswered questions suddenly felt closer than ever, yet every answer seemed to create an even darker mystery. Michael had died protecting the journal. Richard Lawson had risked exposing himself after decades of hiding. And now Daniel's final message pointed directly toward the one place Ethan had never thought to search, his mother's grave. Before anyone could continue the discussion, Ethan's phone rang. The caller ID displayed a restricted number. Olivia immediately shook her head. Don't answer. Ethan ignored her and pressed the speaker button. This is Ethan Brooks. Silence filled the room for several seconds. Then Richard Lawson's calm voice emerged from the speaker. Good evening, Mr. Brooks. Olivia covered her mouth in shock. Detective Sullivan quietly began signaling another officer to trace the call. Ethan remained perfectly still. You killed Michael. Richard sighed almost sadly. Michael made his own choices. Ethan's voice hardened. You murdered my brother. Another pause followed. Your brother died because he believed the world rewarded honesty. Ethan clenched his jaw. You're wrong. Richard chuckled softly. Am I? His tone remained disturbingly relaxed. Look around you, Ethan. I've been officially dead for nearly 4 decades. Yet I built an empire while governments, police departments, and billion-dollar corporations continued protecting my interests without even realizing it. Detective Sullivan silently wrote "Keep him talking" on a notepad and held it toward Ethan. Ethan understood immediately. Every extra second increased the chance of tracing the call. Why are you calling me? Richard answered without hesitation. Because I respect your brother. Ethan frowned. You expect me to believe that? Richard continued calmly. Daniel was one of the few men I ever met who couldn't be bought. That made him dangerous, but also admirable. Ethan felt sick listening to the man speak about Daniel so casually. If you admired him so much, why did you destroy his life? Richard's voice became colder. Because he forced me to choose between sentiment and survival. Ethan looked toward Sullivan, who quietly signaled that the trace was still running. Then why not kill me too? Richard laughed quietly. Because you're much more useful alive. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Useful for what? Richard answered with complete confidence. To lead me to what Daniel hid. The line suddenly went silent. Then disconnected. Sullivan looked down at his laptop in frustration. Lost him. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. He doesn't know where it is. Olivia looked confused. What makes you say that? Ethan held up Daniel's journal. If Richard knew what was beneath Mom's grave, Michael would never have needed to protect this. The realization spread across the room almost instantly. For the first time in 22 years, Richard Lawson was chasing Ethan. Because Ethan now possessed the only map leading to whatever Daniel had hidden. Sullivan stood immediately. We have to secure St. Matthew's Cemetery. Ethan shook his head. No. Both Olivia and Sullivan looked at him in disbelief. If police surround the cemetery, Richard won't come. Olivia stared at her brother. So what are you planning? Ethan slowly looked down at Daniel's journal. Then toward the silver watch lying beside it. Finally he looked back at the detective. We go before sunrise. Sullivan frowned. Just the three of us? Ethan nodded. The moment daylight comes, Richard will already know we're too late. At exactly that moment another notification appeared on Ethan's phone. This one wasn't a text. It was a live security camera alert from St. Matthew's Cemetery. Someone had just entered the cemetery at 3:17 a.m. The camera automatically captured one blurry frame before the video feed went black. The figure standing in front of Margaret Brooks' grave. Without wasting another second, Ethan grabbed Daniel's journal, the silver watch, and his car keys before rushing toward the elevator. Detective Sullivan followed close behind while Olivia struggled to keep pace. Chicago's streets were nearly empty at that hour, the heavy rain finally beginning to ease into a cold mist that clung to the pavement. Ethan drove faster than he ever had before, ignoring nearly every speed limit, as the cemetery's security alert remained frozen on his phone's screen. The final captured image haunted him. A shadowy figure stood beside Margaret Brooks' grave holding a shovel. There was no way of knowing whether it was Richard Lawson or someone working for him, but Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Daniel had hidden something beneath their mother's grave, whoever arrived first would decide how the story ended. 20 minutes later they reached the wrought iron gates of St. Matthew's Cemetery. The gates stood partially open. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Sullivan before stepping out into the cold night air. The cemetery was completely silent. Hundreds of gravestones stretched into the darkness beneath rows of towering oak trees. A thin layer of fog drifted just above the ground, making visibility almost impossible beyond a few yards. Sullivan quietly drew his service pistol. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Ethan shook his head. "She's my mother." Without waiting for permission, he started running between the rows of graves. Margaret Brooks' grave sat near the highest point of the cemetery beneath an old maple tree. As Ethan approached, relief washed over him. The grave itself appeared untouched. No fresh dirt, no shovel, no signs of excavation, but the relief lasted only seconds. He noticed muddy footprints surrounding the headstone. Someone had definitely been there within the last hour. Sullivan crouched beside the footprints and examined them with his flashlight. "One person," he whispered. "Heavy boots. Size 11, maybe 12. Olivia looked around nervously. "Where did he go?" Ethan stepped closer to the headstone. The familiar marble marker looked exactly as it always had. Margaret Brooks. "Beloved mother, forever in our hearts." Ethan slowly knelt and brushed away wet leaves gathered around the base of the monument. Something immediately caught his attention. A small brass screw hidden beneath years of moss reflected his flashlight. He frowned. This wasn't here before. Sullivan joined him. Together they carefully removed the moss covering the base of the headstone. 4 identical brass screws appeared, one at each corner. Olivia looked confused. Gravestones don't have screws. Ethan carefully touched one with his fingers. It was loose. Sullivan reached into his pocket, removed a multi-tool, and slowly unscrewed all 4 bolts. The marble base shifted slightly. Ethan looked at the detective. Neither man spoke. Together they carefully lifted the front section of the monument only a few inches. Beneath it rested a small waterproof steel container no larger than a shoebox. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. Daniel hadn't hidden anything beneath the grave itself. He had hidden it inside the monument. Sullivan carefully removed the container and placed it on the wet grass. It remained sealed by a heavy combination lock. Ethan immediately looked toward Daniel's journal, hoping for some clue. Olivia quickly flipped through every page until a folded photograph slipped onto the ground. She picked it up. It showed Ethan and Daniel as children celebrating Ethan's 10th birthday. Behind them stood their mother, smiling warmly. Daniel had written something across the bottom years later. "The code is the day Mom taught us to be brothers." Olivia frowned. "What does that even mean?" Ethan took the photograph and stared at it. Suddenly his expression changed. "I know." Olivia looked at him. "How?" Ethan smiled sadly. "The day I turned 10 wasn't the important date." He pointed toward the cake in the photograph. There were only 9 candles. Olivia looked confused until realization slowly crossed her face. "The picture wasn't taken on your birthday." Ethan nodded. "It was taken the day Mom adopted Daniel." Sullivan immediately entered the adoption to Ethan remembered from childhood into the lock. The mechanism clicked open instantly. No one moved. For several long seconds they simply stared at the unopened steel container. Finally Ethan lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of old documents, several VHS tapes sealed in plastic, a stack of cassette recordings, a thick folder labeled Lawson Shipping Holdings, and a sealed envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting. For Ethan only. Ethan slowly reached for the envelope. Before his fingers touched it, a single gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet struck the steel container, sending sparks into the air. Olivia screamed. Sullivan immediately pushed Ethan to the ground while drawing his weapon. A familiar voice echoed through the fog. "You should have left the grave alone, Mr. Brooks." Richard Lawson stepped out from behind the maple tree, holding a silenced pistol pointed directly at Ethan's. The gunshot echoed across St. Matthew's Cemetery before disappearing into the thick morning fog. Ethan instinctively covered the steel container with his body as Detective Sullivan dragged Olivia behind the marble headstone. Richard Lawson stood only 30 feet away, his silenced pistol held steady, his expression completely calm. He looked more like a man arriving for a business meeting than someone attempting murder. Around him, 6 more armed men slowly emerged from between the gravestones, surrounding the small hill from every direction. Ethan immediately understood they had walked into a trap. Richard smiled faintly as he watched Ethan shielding Daniel's evidence. "Your brother always did inspire unnecessary bravery," he said. Ethan slowly stood despite Sullivan's attempt to pull him back down. "This ends tonight." Richard tilted his head slightly. "It ended 22 years ago." Ethan held the sealed envelope tightly in one hand, while the journal remained tucked beneath his jacket. "You killed him because he refused to work for you." Richard remained silent for several seconds before answering. "No." Ethan frowned. "No." Richard lowered his pistol slightly, almost as though he wanted Ethan to hear every word clearly. "Daniel Brooks was the smartest young engineer I had ever met. I offered him a future that most men would have sacrificed their souls to obtain. He refused because he believed laws mattered more than power." Richard's smile disappeared. "That was his mistake." Ethan's voice grew louder. "His mistake was trusting you." Richard slowly nodded. "Yes." The unexpected agreement caught Ethan off guard. Your brother trusted that exposing corruption would change the world. It didn't. Governments survived. Corporations survived. Every politician he wanted to expose became richer than ever. Richard looked toward the steel container lying open beside the grave. The only thing Daniel accomplished was getting himself killed. Before Ethan could respond, Detective Sullivan suddenly stepped out from behind the monument with his weapon raised. "Richard Lawson!" he shouted. "Drop the gun!" Richard looked almost amused. "Detective, after all these years, you're still giving impossible orders." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly who you are." Richard smiled again. "No." His voice remained calm. "You know the name I allowed the world to remember." Sullivan pulled a small folder from inside his jacket and threw it onto the wet grass between them. Several photographs scattered across the ground. One by one, the images showed Richard Lawson standing beside governors, senators, judges, military officers, and billionaires spanning nearly 4 decades. "We found them," Sullivan said. "Every identity, every company, every shell corporation." Richard glanced briefly at the photographs before looking back at Sullivan. "And yet," he spread his arms slightly, "I'm still standing here." Ethan noticed something strange. Richard wasn't worried. He wasn't even surprised. It was as though he had expected the photographs to surface eventually. That realization sent a chill through Ethan's body. Richard slowly looked toward Ethan once more. "Open the envelope." Ethan frowned. "What?" Richard pointed toward the sealed letter Daniel had addressed only to him. "Open it." Ethan's grip tightened. "Why would I do anything you ask?" Richard answered quietly. "Because your brother lied to you." Silence fell over the cemetery. Olivia looked at Ethan in disbelief. Sullivan kept his pistol aimed steadily at Richard. Ethan slowly shook his head. "You're trying to manipulate me." Richard sighed. "Then keep believing the fairy tale." He nodded toward the envelope again. "Daniel never hid those documents to expose me." Ethan felt anger rising again. "You're lying." Richard smiled sadly. "Read the letter." Ethan looked down at the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but Daniel's handwriting remained unmistakable. For a long moment he hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, he finally broke the old seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means Michael kept his promise. Before you judge anyone, including Richard Lawson, you must know one terrible truth. Everything the newspapers reported about my disappearance was false, but so was everything I told Michael. I wasn't running from Richard. I was running from someone much more powerful. Richard tried to stop them. I failed. If Richard is still alive when you read this, don't shoot him until he tells you the name I never dared write down. That name is the only reason I never came home." Ethan slowly lowered the letter. His mind refused to accept what he had just read. Richard Lawson hadn't been the man Daniel feared most. Richard quietly watched Ethan's face. "You finally understand," he said softly. Ethan looked up. Who was he talking about? Richard's expression became darker than Ethan had ever seen. For the first time, Richard Lawson actually looked afraid. He slowly answered with only 2 words. "Your father." The words struck Ethan harder than any bullet ever could. "Your father." For several seconds he simply stared at Richard Lawson, convinced he had misheard him. The cemetery disappeared around him. The rain, the armed men, Detective Sullivan shouting commands, Olivia calling his name. Everything faded into silence except those 2 impossible words. Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." His voice barely escaped his lips. "My father died 30 years ago." Richard's expression remained painfully serious. "That's what your mother wanted you to believe." Ethan's breathing became uneven. "You're lying." Richard slowly lowered his pistol until it pointed harmlessly toward the ground. "I expected that reaction." Ethan unfolded Daniel's letter again, desperately searching for something that would prove Richard wrong. Instead, another folded sheet slipped from inside the envelope. He opened it carefully. It was an old family photograph he had never seen before. Standing beside his mother and a teenage Ethan was Daniel, and beside them stood a tall man wearing dark sunglasses. Ethan's heart stopped. The man wasn't his father. Yet on the back of the photograph, Daniel had written only one sentence. "The man we called Dad wasn't our father." Olivia stepped closer, reading the words over Ethan's shoulder. "This can't be real." Detective Sullivan slowly removed his glasses, his face pale with disbelief. Richard quietly continued speaking. 23 years ago, Daniel discovered something by accident while tracing financial records connected to Lawson Shipping. One account belonged to a man named Jonathan Brooks. Ethan frowned. "My father." Richard nodded slowly. "No, the man who raised you." Ethan felt his knees weaken. Richard continued. "Your real father never used that name." Ethan whispered. "Who was he?" Richard toward the rising sun beginning to appear through the morning fog. "A man powerful enough to erase his own family from history." Ethan's voice shook. "Tell me his name." Richard closed his eyes briefly before answering. "Alexander Bennett." Detective Sullivan immediately froze. "Impossible." Ethan looked toward him. "You know that name?" Sullivan nodded slowly. "Alexander Bennett disappeared 26 years ago." Richard corrected him quietly. "No." He looked directly at Ethan. "He became someone else." Ethan felt sick. "Who?" Richard hesitated for the first time since they had met. "The man the country eventually elected president." Silence exploded across the cemetery. Olivia stepped backward in complete shock. Sullivan lowered his weapon, without even realizing it. Ethan stared at Richard as though the world itself had stopped making sense. "You're saying," Richard nodded, "that your real father spent decades living under another identity." Ethan looked back down at Daniel's letter. Suddenly every piece of the puzzle began fitting together. Daniel hadn't hidden evidence about organized crime alone. He had uncovered an identity capable of destroying the highest office in the country. Richard quietly walked several steps closer, ignoring the guns pointed toward him. Daniel understood what exposing that truth would do. Ethan looked up. He still wanted to reveal it. Richard shook his head. "No." Ethan frowned. "Then why hide the evidence?" Richard answered softly. "Because he couldn't decide." Ethan stared at him. Richard continued. "Your brother spent months debating whether the truth would save millions of people or destroy the nation itself." Ethan looked again at Daniel's final letter. The handwriting near the bottom suddenly caught his attention. It was smaller than the rest, almost hidden beneath the fold. "If you ever find this, Ethan, don't ask whether the truth should be told. Ask whether people are ready to survive it." Tears filled Ethan's eyes. For the first time in 22 years, he understood why Daniel had never come home. His brother hadn't died protecting documents. He had died protecting a decision. Richard slowly extended his empty hand toward Ethan. "Give me the evidence." Ethan remained motionless. Richard's voice became quieter than ever. "I spent 22 years making sure no one else died because of what Daniel found." Sullivan suddenly stepped between them. "Or maybe you spent 22 years protecting yourself." Richard smiled sadly. "Detective, those are exactly the same thing." Before anyone could move, the sound of helicopters thundered across the sky. 3 black military helicopters appeared above the cemetery. Dozens of armed federal agents fast-roped onto the surrounding hills, surrounding everyone within seconds. One officer stepped forward holding a sealed arrest warrant. He looked directly at Ethan. Not Richard. "Mr. Ethan Brooks, you are under arrest for possession of classified federal material." Ethan slowly looked down at Daniel's journal still clutched in his hands. Only then did he finally understand. The evidence had never been hidden from Richard. It had been hidden from the